I gotta declare Dan the winner of this round. Dan
I'm
won.
sorry.
I gotta give it to Dan. And that's why I gotta give it to Dan. Based on the arguments, I gotta give it to Dan.
So
I gotta call it for Dan. So Dan ultimately gets the point. So ultimately, I'm gonna give it to Dan. That puts Dan over the edge by 1. I gotta give it to Dan. I think I gotta give it to Dan. Well, I think we all gave it to you, Dan.
Yeah.
So very good for you. Annoyingly, that just means Dan wins again. Dan wins! Dan wins again! Dan wins! So I'm gonna give Spencer and Dan points. Dan is our winner! So I gotta give it to Boyhood and Dan. I'm giving Dan the point. Dan gets the point. Dan gets the point. Dan wins! Out of those arguments, you pulled it out the end. Mr. Murrell gets the first point. Dan wins! Based on the arguments, I think someone clutched it in their final, and I think it was Dan Murrell! Dan pulled it very closely there at the end with some really good facts, and I think There Will Be Blood is taking the point. Dan gets it. Dan takes it to the end. Dan has the point. Dan gets the point again. I'm gonna give it to Dan. Dan gets the point. So I'm gonna give it to Dan for the point. So I'm gonna go with Dan. So Dan gets the point. Why I'm gonna give the point to Dan. Dan gets the point. I give Dan the point on that. Gotta go with Dan. Dan pulls it out.
Wow.
Dan Murrell get the first point of the show. I gotta give it to Dan again. That's 2 points for Dan. And Dan got the slight edge. I hate to. It's gotta go to Dan. I'm gonna give it to Dan on that one.
Yeah.
I just think Dan really brought it. Dan gets the point. Sadly, I picked Dan. That makes it less exciting. So I gotta give that one to Dan. I gotta give it to Raiders and Dan for the first point. Dan gets the point. I think based on the arguments there, Dan gets the point. Dan gets the point. Dan gets the point. All right, Dan gets the point. So Dan gets the first point. Dan gets the point. Dan gets the point.